What happens when the most powerful Democrat in the Senate suddenly finds himself trapped in a political corner he built with his own hands? Chuck Schumer thought he had control, the shutdown, the headlines, the narrative, but something shifted overnight. The plan backfired in a way that no strategist in Washington saw coming. The very move meant to weaken Trump has instead exposed the Democrats' biggest vulnerability, and it's spreading through their ranks faster than they can contain it. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why Schumer's worst nightmare isn't about Trump, but about losing the one thing Washington fears most. You know, this funny thing about power in Washington. People think it comes from votes or titles or committee assignments. But really, power comes from something much simpler, the ability to control what people believe. And for decades, Chuck Schumer mastered that game. He knew how to craft a narrative, push it through friendly media outlets, and watch it become accepted truth by the next news cycle. It was almost clockwork. So when the government shutdown began, Schumer had every reason to feel confident. This was supposed to be his masterstroke. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Force Republicans into a corner, make them look like the obstruction, and watch public opinion turn against conservatives. Frame it as Republicans playing games while Americans suffered. Paint Trump as the villain, control the story. And honestly, it should have worked. That playbook had succeeded before, hadn't it? Think back to previous shutdowns. The party willing to hold firm usually pays the political price. Public frustration builds, moderates get nervous, someone blinks first. And in Washington, blinking first means losing. Schumer was counting on that pattern repeating itself. He figured Republicans would fracture under pressure. Some would defect, others would call for compromise, Trump would face criticism from his own party. The whole thing would collapse within days, maybe a week or two at most. But then, something unexpected happened. Or rather, something expected didn't happen. Republicans didn't fracture. They didn't panic. They held the line. And more importantly, they started explaining why. See, here's where Schumer's calculation went wrong. He assumed people would automatically blame Republicans for the shutdown because that's what usually happens. But this time, Republicans had a simple message that cut through all the noise. We're asking for a clean spending bill, 27 pages, no extra padding, no unrelated projects, just the essentials to keep government running. That's it. Meanwhile, Democrats were demanding trillions, yes, trillions in additional spending on programs that had nothing to do with keeping the lights on. Projects for various interest groups, funding for priorities that could easily wait, all attached to what should have been a straightforward continuing resolution. When you put it that way, who sounds more reasonable? Who sounds like they're playing games? Now, I want you to imagine sitting at your kitchen table trying to manage your own budget. You need to pay the electric bill, keep food on the table, maybe set aside something for prescriptions. Then imagine someone telling you that before you can pay those essential bills, you also have to agree to buy a new boat, renovate the neighbor's house, and fund a community project 3 towns over. You'd think they were crazy, right? That's essentially what Democrats were insisting on. And Americans started to notice. Polling began shifting in ways that alarmed Democratic strategists. Independents, who typically blamed both sides during shutdowns, started putting more responsibility on Democrats. This time, working-class voters saw through the theatrics. Even some traditionally liberal voters questioned why essential services were being held hostage for unrelated demands. The narrative Schumer had carefully constructed was crumbling.
And worse, he couldn't plug the holes fast enough. Every press conference where he blamed Republicans just raised more questions about why Democrats wouldn't accept a clean bill. Every talking point fell flatter than the last. That's when the plan began to unravel, and Trump made his move. While Schumer was busy trying to control the political narrative, Trump was operating on a completely different level. He wasn't interested in winning news cycles, he was interested in solving actual problems. And one of the biggest problems during any government shutdown is that military personnel don't get paid. Think about that for a moment. Young men and women serving this country, many stationed overseas, many with families depending on them, suddenly facing uncertainty about their next paycheck. Not because of any military crisis or budget shortage, but because politicians in Washington couldn't agree on spending priorities. That's not just unfortunate, it's unconscionable. So Trump did something both simple and brilliant. He directed the Pentagon to redirect available funds to ensure military paychecks continued flowing during the shutdown. No grand announcement, no elaborate press conference, just quiet, decisive action to solve a real problem for real people. Now you might be thinking, wait, can a president do that? Is that legal? And that's exactly what Democrats started asking. In fact, they seemed more concerned about the legality of paying troops than they were about the troops not getting paid in the first place. Let that sink in. One Democratic congressman actually went on television and argued it was unconstitutional to pay the military during a shutdown. Constitutional scholars might debate the finer points, but to most Americans, the optics were devastating. Here were Democrats literally arguing that soldiers shouldn't be paid while Trump was making sure they got their paychecks anyway. But this wasn't just a financial decision. It was a psychological one. Trump understood something fundamental about leadership that Schumer missed. When you're in charge, people don't just want to hear you talk about problems. They want to see you solve them. They want action, not excuses. They want results, not rhetoric. And in that single move, Trump demonstrated leadership while Democrats demonstrated obstruction. He showed people could be protected even when politicians were fighting. He proved government could still function if someone was willing to make it function. The symbolism was powerful. While Schumer was arguing about budget points and parliamentary procedure, Trump was ensuring a soldier's rent got paid. While Democrats were holding press conferences, Trump was taking care of military families. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Now here's where the optics were really shifted into high gear. Headlines started appearing across news sites, social media, even some mainstream outlets that typically lean left. Trump ensures military pay during shutdown. Simple, direct, effective. Compare that to the alternative headlines. Democrats question legality of military payments, or Schumer, paying troops during a shutdown may be unconstitutional. Which message do you think resonated more with the American public? Veterans groups started speaking up. Military families expressed gratitude. Even people who didn't particularly like Trump personally had to admit this was the right thing to do. And suddenly, Schumer's carefully constructed narrative about Republicans causing chaos was replaced by a much simpler story. Democrats were willing to let troops go unpaid to score political points. You see, in politics, momentum is everything. Once a narrative takes hold, it's almost impossible to dislodge. And the narrative that was taking hold wasn't the one Schumer wanted. Instead of Republicans shut down government, it became Democrats block military pay. Instead of Trump causes chaos, it became Trump protects troops. The media landscape, which Schumer had counted on to amplify his message, started fracturing. Some outlets stuck to the script, sure, but others began cautiously reporting the facts in ways that didn't help the Democratic cause. When even friendly journalists start asking uncomfortable questions, that's when you know the message isn't working. Social media accelerated the shift.
Videos of Democrats refusing to vote for military pay spread rapidly. Clips of Schumer's tense press conferences, where his frustration was visible, went viral. Memes contrasting Trump's action with Democratic inaction filled timelines. The decentralized nature of modern media meant Schumer couldn't control the conversation the way he once could. And while Schumer was scrambling to explain, the cracks inside his own party began to show. You have to understand, the Democratic Party right now is not a unified force. It's a coalition of different factions with different priorities, held together more by opposition to Republicans than by any shared vision. And when pressure builds, coalitions tend to fracture. The progressive wing of the party has been growing restless for years. They see the old establishment, people like Schumer, Pelosi, Biden, as relics of a bygone era. They want bolder action, more radical change, faster movement on their priorities. They're tired of being told to wait, to compromise, to accept incremental progress. And this shutdown was revealing those tensions in real time. While Schumer was trying to maintain party discipline, progressives were questioning the strategy. Why were they fighting over this particular bill? Why weren't they demanding more? Why did leadership keep making compromises that satisfied no one? behind closed doors, the whispers were getting louder. Some progressives were openly discussing leadership challenges. Names like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were being floated as potential alternatives. Not immediately, perhaps, but in the next election cycle. The message was clear. The younger generation was losing patience with the old guard. Donors were getting nervous too. Not the ideological donors who would stick with Democrats through anything, but the pragmatic ones who cared about winning elections and maintaining influence. They could see the polling, they could read the mood, and they were starting to question whether Schumer's leadership was helping or hurting. For the first time in his career, Chuck Schumer wasn't just managing external pressure from Republicans, he was dealing with internal revolt from his own party. He wasn't dictating the story anymore, he was reacting to it. And in politics, once you're on defense, it's incredibly hard to regain the initiative. But internal revolt wasn't his only problem. Public trust was collapsing too. Let's talk about numbers for a moment, because numbers tell stories that words sometimes can't. Trump's approval rating had been climbing steadily since taking office for his second term. We're talking about ratings in the mid to upper 50% range, numbers that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. More importantly, those numbers were higher than Obama's were at the same point in his presidency, higher than Bush's, higher than most modern presidents. Meanwhile, Democratic approval was sinking. National polls showed the party's favorability somewhere in the 20s to low 30s range. That's not just bad, that's historically terrible. We're talking about approval numbers that signal deep public dissatisfaction with the party's direction, message, and leadership. But here's what really worried Democratic strategists: the demographic breakdown. The groups that had reliably voted blue for decades were shifting. Working-class Latino voters, particularly men, were moving toward Republicans in numbers that should have been impossible according to traditional political models. Younger voters, especially Gen Z men, weren't following the expected pattern of becoming more liberal. Instead, they were responding to populist America First messaging in ways that defied conventional wisdom. The coalition that had powered Democratic victories was fracturing, and nobody in party leadership seemed to have a plan to stop it. Think about it from the perspective of an average working American. Maybe you're a union member in Michigan, or a small business owner in Arizona, or a retired veteran in North Carolina. What message were Democrats offering you? Higher taxes to fund programs for people who entered the country illegally? Lectures about privilege and systemic issues? Policies that seemed more concerned with international affairs than your own community?
Meanwhile, Republicans were talking about secure borders, bringing manufacturing jobs back, standing up to China, protecting American workers first. Simple messages, clear priorities, easy to understand and relate to. And when that government shutdown happened, it crystallized the choice. Democrats were willing to shut everything down unless they got funding for their wish list. Republicans were saying, let's pass a clean bill and keep things running. Which approach sounds more focused on ordinary Americans? The political tide was turning faster than anyone could sandbag it. And just when Democrats thought it couldn't get worse, it did. You know, there's an old saying in politics: when you've lost the media, you've lost everything. And I'm not talking about conservative media or alternative outlets. I'm talking about the mainstream networks and publications that had faithfully echoed Democratic talking points for years. The outlets that could be counted on to frame stories in the most favorable light possible for Democrats. Even they were starting to crack. It started subtly. A headline here or there that was slightly less favorable. A new segment that presented both sides more evenly. Journalists asking Democrats tougher questions during interviews. Nothing dramatic at first, just a gradual shift in tone and approach, but gradually accelerated into something more significant. Some outlets began cautiously admitting that maybe, just maybe, the Democratic strategy on the shutdown wasn't working. Some reporters started acknowledging that tying essential government funding to controversial spending priorities might not have been the smartest move. Even the networks that used to echo every talking point started to go quiet. And in media, silence speaks volumes. Why was this happening? Well, journalists aren't stupid. They can read polls same as anyone else. They can sense when public opinion is shifting, and they know that if they're too far out of step with their audience, they lose credibility, they lose viewers, they lose relevance. We're living in an era where trust in traditional media is at historic lows. Numbers show public confidence in major news organizations somewhere between the low 20s to mid-30s% range. That's catastrophic for an industry that depends on being seen as trustworthy and authoritative. So when a story isn't resonating, when the narrative they're pushing is clearly failing, some journalists start to pull back. Not out of any principled stand necessarily, but out of self-preservation. They don't want to go down with a sinking ship. And the ship was definitely sinking. Ratings for shows that spent all their time defending Democratic positions were declining. Subscriptions were dropping. Audiences were tuning out. Meanwhile, alternative media sources, podcasts, independent journalists, social media personalities were gaining ground by simply presenting information and letting people make up their own minds. When the echo chamber falls silent, that's when panic sets in. And panic was exactly what started showing in Chuck Schumer's public appearances. If you watched his press conferences during this period, you could see the change in real time. The polished, controlled Senate Majority Leader was replaced by someone visibly frustrated, increasingly defensive, struggling to maintain composure. He started snapping at reporters who asked reasonable questions. His answers became longer, more convoluted, full of justifications and explanations that raised more questions than they answered. The body language told the story. Crossed arms, tight jaw, eyes that dotted around looking for escape routes. This wasn't the demeanor of someone winning. This was someone watching their strategy collapse and not knowing how to stop it. There's a fascinating psychological dynamic that happens when a leader starts losing control. People can sense it. It's almost primal. When you're confident and in command, it shows in everything you do. Your posture, your tone, your willingness to engage. But when you're defensive and uncertain, that shows too. And once people pick up on that weakness, it's almost impossible to put the genie back in the bottle.
Schumer had built his career on projecting strength and control. He was the master tactician, the strategic genius who always had a plan. But now the plan wasn't working, and everyone could see it. His press conferences became exercises in damage control rather than message amplification. Reporters started asking why he wouldn't allow a vote on a clean, continuing resolution. Why was he holding military pay hostage? Why weren't Democrats willing to negotiate? And his answers, filled with references to Republican obstruction and procedural concerns, just didn't land. They sounded like excuses. Compare that to Trump's messaging during the same period. Short, direct, confident. We're keeping the military paid. We're standing firm on fiscal responsibility. We're putting America first. No elaborate explanations needed. No defensive posturing. Just clarity and action. Now, political weakness isn't just about polls or press conferences. It's about perception. Once the perception takes hold that a leader is losing control, it becomes self-fulfilling. People start positioning themselves accordingly. Allies become less vocal in their support. Critics become more bold. The whole ecosystem shifts, and perception, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. You can't speech your way out of a perception problem. You can't poll test your way back to credibility. The only way to rebuild is through consistent action over time. But Schumer didn't have time. Events were moving too fast. His own senators were getting nervous calls from constituents. Town halls were getting contentious. The pressure was building from below, and leadership wasn't providing clear direction from above. That's a recipe for chaos in any organization, whether it's a business, a military unit, or a political party. But this wasn't just about one senator, or one shutdown, or even one political moment. When you zoom out, you start to see something much bigger happening. The Democratic Party was facing structural problems that went far deeper than any single leader could fix. For decades, Democrats had built their coalition on certain assumptions, that working-class Americans would naturally side with the party claiming to represent workers, that minority communities would remain reliably blue, that young people would follow the progressive path, that the future belonged to urban, educated, multicultural voters. Every single one of those assumptions was being challenged. The coalition was fracturing along unexpected lines, and party leadership seemed genuinely confused about how to respond. Part of the problem was generational.
The leaders running the party were in their 70s and 80s, trying to connect with voters in their 20s and 30s. The cultural gap was enormous. The priorities were different. The communication styles didn't match up. The very language they used felt outdated. Younger Democrats didn't relate to the old guard anymore. They didn't remember the Cold War or the Clinton years or any of the formative experiences that shaped their leaders' worldviews. They grew up in a completely different America, with different challenges, different technologies, different ways of understanding the world. And when these younger voters looked at their party's leadership, they saw people who seemed out of touch. Watching Schumer or Pelosi or Biden try to connect with Gen Z voters was sometimes painful. The references didn't land. The jokes fell flat. The whole dynamic felt awkward and forced. Meanwhile, the Republican message was resonating across generational lines in unexpected ways. Why? Because it was simple, direct, and focused on concrete issues people actually cared about. Jobs, safety, fairness, strength. These aren't complicated concepts that require elite education to understand. They're universal human concerns. The party that once sold hope was now struggling to sell coherence. Their message was fragmented, their priorities unclear, their leadership aging and increasingly disconnected from the base they claimed to represent. Meanwhile, Trump's movement kept expanding, and not just politically. This is where things get really interesting, because what we were witnessing wasn't just a political realignment. It was a cultural shift that went much deeper than party labels or election cycles. Think about what Trump represented to millions of Americans. Not the man himself necessarily, but what he symbolized. He was the guy who didn't talk like a politician, who didn't pretend to be something he wasn't,
who said what he thought and did what he said, who fought back when attacked instead of apologizing, who put America's interests first without embarrassment or qualification. That resonated with people who felt like they had been managed, manipulated, and talked down to by establishment politicians for decades. People who were tired of carefully crafted messages that said nothing. Tired of leaders who seemed more concerned with international opinion than their own citizens' well-being. Tired of being told their concerns were illegitimate or their values were outdated. This movement was about more than tax policy or immigration enforcement or any single issue. It was about authenticity versus performance, about results versus rhetoric, about empowerment versus management. And once that cultural shift takes hold, it's almost impossible to reverse through conventional political tactics. You saw it in how people talked about politics in their daily lives. The quiet conversations at diners and barbershops and church socials. The things people said when they thought no one was listening. There was a hunger for leaders who actually led, who took responsibility, who made decisions and stood by them. The old model of politics, carefully poll-tested messages delivered by focus group candidates who never said anything controversial, wasn't working anymore. People could smell the inauthenticity a mile away. They wanted real, even if real was rough around the edges. This isn't just about one election or one political cycle. It's a societal realignment, and those don't happen often, maybe once or twice in a generation. But when they do, they reshape everything. Think back to other major realignments in American history. The New Deal era, the Reagan Revolution. These weren't just political victories. They were fundamental shifts in how Americans thought about government, about society, about their own role in the democratic process. They lasted for decades and defined entire eras. We're living through one of those moments right now. And what's driving it isn't Trump himself necessarily, but what he unleashed. A demand for authenticity, for action, for leaders who serve the people rather than managing them. And that right there is what keeps Schumer awake at night, because he built his career in the old system. He mastered the old rules. He knew how to play the old game, but the game has changed, and he doesn't know how to adapt. Let's talk about power for a moment, because understanding power is key to understanding what's happening. In the old model, political power came from controlling institutions. Control the Senate, you control legislation. Control the media narrative, you control public opinion. control the party apparatus, you control who gets nominated and who gets resources. Schumer understood that model intimately. He knew how to work the levers of institutional power. He could make or break careers through committee assignments. He could shape legislation through procedural maneuvering. He could coordinate messaging across the Democratic caucus and friendly media outlets. But here's what he didn't fully grasp. Institutional power matters a lot less when people stop trusting institutions. And Americans' trust in institutions has been declining for years. Trust in Congress, in media, in political parties, in government generally, all at historic lows. When that happens, the old power structures start to crumble. Controlling the Senate means less when people see the Senate as dysfunctional. Shaping the media narrative means less when people don't trust the media.
Party discipline means less when voters identify less with parties. It's like trying to plug a dam with a paperclip. You might temporarily stop one leak, but the pressure behind the dam keeps building, and eventually the whole structure gives way. That's what Democrats were experiencing. They still had institutional power. They controlled the Senate, after all. They still had media allies and financial resources and organizational infrastructure, but none of it seemed to matter as much as it used to. The ground was shifting beneath their feet. And when your strategy depends on institutional control, but institutions are losing legitimacy, what do? Schumer didn't have a good answer to that question. Neither did most Democratic leaders. They kept trying the same tactics that had worked before, not realizing that the landscape had fundamentally changed. Even traditional allies started distancing themselves to protect their own futures. Some Democratic senators began quietly signaling that they weren't entirely on board with leadership's shutdown strategy. Some media figures started hedging their coverage. Some donors started diversifying their political portfolios. Nobody wanted to be too closely associated with a losing strategy. That's human nature. When the ship starts taking on water, people start looking for lifeboats. By the time the dust settles, this won't just be a political loss. It'll be a paradigm shift. Future political scientists will look back at this period and recognize it as a turning point. Not because of any single event, but because of what all these events revealed about the changing nature of American politics and society. The old bargains no longer hold. The old coalitions have fractured. The old messages don't resonate. The old leaders are struggling to adapt. And into that vacuum, new movements and new voices are emerging. This is what creative destruction looks like in politics. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It challenges long-held assumptions and disrupts established patterns. But it's also how systems renew themselves, how new possibilities emerge, how genuine change happens. So what happens next? That's the question everyone's asking. Will Democrats reform, or will new leaders rise from their ashes? Will Republicans maintain unity or fracture under success? Will Trump's movement outlast Trump himself? Will the cultural realignment continue or reverse? Nobody knows for certain. History is contingent. Small decisions can have enormous consequences. Unexpected events can change everything overnight. But we can see the trajectories, the momentum, the underlying forces at work. If Democrats continue down their current path, defending institutional prerogatives, doubling down on unpopular positions, refusing to acknowledge their coalition is fractured, they'll likely face more losses ahead. Not just in elections, but in relevance and influence.
If they're willing to genuinely reform, rethink their message, elevate new leaders, reconnect with working Americans, focus on concrete problems rather than abstract ideologies, they might rebuild. But reform is hard. It requires admitting mistakes, challenging orthodoxies, and empowering people who might threaten the current leadership. For Republicans, the challenge is different. They're winning right now, but winning creates its own problems. Success breeds complacency. Unity during opposition can fracture when you're in power and have to make actual governing decisions. The coalition Trump built is powerful,
but also fragile in some ways, held together by shared opposition more than shared vision. The question is whether Republicans can translate electoral success into lasting institutional change. Can they actually drain the swamp, or will they just become part of it? Can they maintain the outsider energy that fueled their rise while wielding insider power? Can they deliver for the voters who trusted them? These aren't easy questions, but they're the right questions, because what we're witnessing isn't the end of a shutdown. It's the beginning of a realignment, and how that realignment unfolds will shape American politics for decades to come. And the irony is Schumer himself triggered it. Not intentionally, of course. He thought he was executing a clever tactical maneuver to put pressure on Republicans. Instead, he exposed all the fault lines in his own party, revealed the weakness of his own position, and accelerated trends that were already undermining Democratic power. Sometimes in politics, the thing you do to strengthen your position actually weakens it. The move you make to expose your opponent's vulnerability ends up exposing your own. The narrative you try to control ends up controlling you. That's what happened here, and now Schumer has to live with the consequences. His legacy, which might have been as a skilled legislative tactician who served his party for decades, will instead be tied to this moment of miscalculation, to the shutdown that backfired, to the realignment he accidentally accelerated. Power shifts when ordinary people stop buying the illusion, and Americans have stopped buying the illusion that Washington works for them. They've stopped buying the illusion that media tells them the truth. They've stopped buying the illusion that political parties represent their interests. That's actually a healthy development in a democracy. When people become skeptical of power, when they demand more from their leaders, when they refuse to accept empty rhetoric as a substitute for real action, that's when genuine accountability becomes possible. It's uncomfortable for those who benefited from the old system. It's disruptive for institutions that depended on public deference, but it's ultimately how democratic systems stay vibrant and responsive. We're living through that disruption right now. And yes, it's messy, it's contentious, it sometimes feels chaotic, but it's also how change happens, how new possibilities emerge, how power genuinely shifts from the few to the many.